So on this question, we've been graphing already, so that part isn't going to be new. In fact, A and B are going to be review of ones we did earlier. C is the first time we see a vertical translation. But the one thing that's different in this question is they restrict the domain. So in the question it says we're only going to graph between 0 and 2 pi. Before we put arrowheads on the end, we did everything. Okay? It's more typical on your exam that your exam will say graph at least one period. So if you do arrowheads on the end, you're perfectly fine because it says at least. But this one was specific to say only from 0 to 2 pi. So in A, right, y equals 3 sine x. We know that that is a vertical stretch. Your y value is by 3. And the shortcut we've learned about that number in front is that we know that our amplitude is 3. So when we go to graph this one, our period is going to be 2 pi, divided into 4 equal sections, pi, pi over 2, and 3 pi over 2. But now since our amplitude is 3, we go from our center line, up 3, down 3, for our maximum and minimum. Where does the sine graph start? On our center line going up, so go up to the max, back to the center line, down to the min, back to the center line. And normally I would do this, but then I'd reread my question and I would get an E9 error for going beyond. The question says only go to 2 pi. So I'd have to take out my eraser. I have to admit there is something really therapeutic about the Smartboard eraser. It's like, feels really nice to erase stuff on here. So now it's exactly between 0 and 2 pi. That one wasn't so bad. B, y equals sine 3x. So that's going to be a horizontal compression, x by 1/3. Our shortcut for this one is we learned a formula that our period is 2 pi divided by our b value. So our period is going to be 2 pi over 3. Which makes sense because if the period normally was 2 pi and you have a horizontal compression by 1/3, your period will now be 2 pi over 3. So normally on your exam, you would just randomly mark somewhere 2 pi over 3 and divide it into 4 equal sections. But for this question, we need to graph from 0 to 2 pi. Can you see that if I have 2 pi over 3 here, this same distance and same distance again, that this would be 2 pi? Because the 2 pi has been divided by 3. So I made this a third, a third, a third of 2 pi. So lots of mental math with fractions. Now as far as graphing this, can you see that your a value is 1? So your amplitude is still going to be 1 and -1 from your center line or sinusoidal axis, which is still at 0. And where does the sine graph start? On our center line going up. So you would go to the maximum, back to the center line, down to your minimum, and back to there. Now this would be normally what you would draw with arrowheads on for one period, at least one period, to continue it. But this question asked us to graph from 0 all the way to 2 pi. So we'd have to keep going in these increments. This one would be divided into 4 sections. This one would be divided into 4 sections. And you keep going from center to maximum to center to minimum to center to maximum to center to minimum to center. And now we've graphed it from 0 to 2 pi. One of the things this wants to show is normally you would have one period from 0 to 2 pi. Does it make sense with a compression of a third that we now have 3 periods between 0 and 2 pi? And finally, the first time we've ever had a vertical translation. So you see that that plus 3 is outside. This would be a vertical translation 3 units up. Vertical translations are the only thing that affect your center line. So now our sinusoidal axis, instead of being at y equals 0, is moved 3 up, is going to be at y equals 3. So if I go 1, 2, 3 and draw my dotted line for my center line at y equals 3, can you see that your amplitude is still 1 in this question? The a value is still 1. So now, if my center line's at 3 and my amplitude is 1, does it make sense that your maximum is 4 and that your minimum is 2? Your b value is still 1, so your period is still going to be 2 pi divided into 4 equal sections. Where does a sine graph start? On your center line going up. So we go up to our maximum, back to our center line, down to our minimum, back to our center line. And this question again, only between 0 and 2 pi, so we would stop our graph there. I'll say in your textbook, sometimes the graph paper they give you is harder to use than it is to draw your own graph on the side. Because here I can set I think the graph paper, they have a whole bunch of pi over 3's always labeled that you don't need, which might make it more difficult. So try graphing it off the side on your own, and then say, could you use the grid paper they gave you and still make it work and fit on there? All right, questions for practice on this one are 6 and 7.